She pointed at the helicopter. $47 million. Wouldn't start. 5 engineers, 3 hours. Nothing. She looked at the man with the mop. Fix it, Sandra said, and I'll kiss you. Right here, right now. In front of everyone, the hangar went completely silent. Ronald Webb looked at her. Looked at the helicopter. Looked back at her. Then he said the thing nobody expected, and if I can't? Sandra didn't blink. You lose your job. No severance. No reference. Nothing. 12 engineers watching. Someone's phone already recording. Ronald set down the mop, walked to the aircraft. And 2 hours later, when that engine roared to life and the rotors started turning and $47 million lifted off the ground like it had never had a problem at all, Sandra walked toward him, ready to keep her word. And Ronald Webb looked her dead in the eye and said the 4 words that made the entire hangar go silent for the second time. What he said next changed everything. Have you ever walked past the same person every single day and had absolutely no idea who they really were? That question matters here, because this story starts in a parking lot, at midnight, in Atlanta, and the man at the center of it is pushing a mop cart past a $47 million helicopter, and nobody in that building knows his name. Not really. The Bell 407 GZA sat under halogen lights like something that deserved to be looked at. Ronald Webb did not look at it. He looked at the floor, pushed the cart, kept his head down in the specific way a man keeps his head down when keeping his head down has become second nature. 6 years of second nature. 6 years of invisible. The cart had a squeaky wheel, left rear. He'd reported it twice. Nobody fixed it. So now it was just part of the rhythm: push, squeak, push. Squeak echoing through 80,000 square feet of steel and concrete, and the particular silence that hangs over a building where everyone with a badge and a salary has already gone home. 12:47 in the morning. Holt Aerotech's research hangar, Atlanta, Georgia, and Ronald Webb. Night custodian employee ID 3847 was doing what he always did at this hour, moving through the dark parts of a building that other people only saw in daylight. Cleaning up after people who never thought about who cleaned up after them. He was almost past it. Almost. The monitoring station near the prototype bay, the one the engineers used during test sequences, had a screen still glowing. Someone hadn't shut it down before leaving. Happened maybe twice a month. Ronald usually walked past it, not his equipment, not his clearance, not his business, except his eyes caught a number, just a number, on a pressure readout, small display in the lower left corner of the diagnostic panel. The kind of thing you'd scroll past if you were looking for something else. The kind of thing that didn't mean anything unless you'd spent 9 years learning what it meant. 0.3% below standard. Then back to baseline. Then 0.3% below again. Ronald stopped walking. The cart wheels stopped squeaking. He stood there in the dark with his hands on the handle and his eyes on that number and something in the back of his skull. The part that doesn't have a name. The part that wakes you up 2 seconds before the alarm goes off. The part that kept him alive in places he doesn't talk about anymore. That part said, that's a pattern. Not random, not sensor noise. A pattern. Every 4 minutes, give or take. Consistent. Small. Creeping. He'd seen something like it before. Not here. Somewhere with more sand and less ceiling, and a lot more at stake. On a UH-60 that had been flagged for routine inspection, and almost wasn't. On a crew that almost didn't come home. On a morning when a 2-hour delay saved lives because somebody noticed a number that everyone else had scrolled past. Ronald Webb noticed numbers like that. He was still noticing them. Even now. Even here. Even in a building where his job was to notice whether someone had missed the trash can and not whether a prototype was developing a fault in its turbine intake. That wouldn't show up on standard diagnostics until it was too late to matter. He stood there for 30 seconds, which is a long time to stand still in an empty building at midnight. Then he heard heels on concrete. Sandra Holt came out of the control room door like she owned the building. She did own the building. Technically. Or close enough that the distinction didn't matter at midnight. She had a tablet. She had the particular walk of someone whose default setting is forward motion. She had eyes that scanned a room the way security cameras scan a parking lot, not looking for anything specific, just cataloging everything present. Those eyes found Ronald in approximately 2 seconds. He was already stepping back, already schooling his face into the careful blankness of a man who has learned that being noticed is usually the beginning of a problem. The tablet didn't come down. "What are you doing over here?" Ronald kept his voice flat, the flatness of someone who has learned not to give unnecessary information. "Cleaning, ma'am." But Sandra's eyes moved from him to the screen and back, and something sharpened in them, not anger exactly, more like the recalibration of someone who has identified an anomaly and is deciding what to do with it. "You were looking at the diagnostic screen." Ronald took another step back, hands visible, posture careful. "Ma'am." She didn't let him finish. "Angela." She didn't raise her voice. Didn't need to. The word just landed in the room like a stone dropped in still water. Angela Cole appeared from somewhere down the corridor in about 45 seconds. 34 years old, sharp blazer, the posture of someone who'd learned to materialize quickly. Sandra didn't look at her when she spoke, still watching Ronald. "Get security to escort him out of this wing, please." Angela's voice was crisp, professional, of course. 2 minutes later, George Price came around the corner. George was 42 and had the build of someone who'd spent 8 years on a Navy carrier and the walk of someone who hadn't quite left it behind. He and Ronald had been splitting a thermos of coffee at 3 in the morning for 6 years. George looked at Ronald the way you look at your best friend, when you have to do something you both understand has to be done. Apologetic, professional, both at once. Ronald went without argument. In the hallway, after the restricted area door clicked shut behind them, George kept walking. Ronald kept pace. Ronald's voice was quiet, not confrontational, just honest. "George." The pressure read out on that screen. George cut him off, not unkind but definite. "Don't." Ronald tried again. "Someone needs to look at it." George stopped, turned, looked at his friend with the expression of a man who cares about the person in front of him, and also needs that person to understand that some conversations cannot happen in this hallway. "You're a custodian. You know what that means?" Ronald met his eyes. "I know what it means." George's voice softened slightly. "Then you know what I'm saying." Ronald looked at him for a moment. Then quietly, "I know what you're saying." He picked up his cart. The left rear wheel squeaked. He pushed it down the hallway, toward the next section that needed cleaning. And George watched him go, and George had worked security long enough to know when someone was walking away from something that was going to come back around. It always came back around. Ronald Webb grew up in Mechanicsville. Not the Mechanicsville that shows up in glossy Atlanta development brochures. The other one, the one with narrow lots and chain-link fences and the particular brand of quiet that settles over a neighborhood where nobody has extra money, but most people have each other. His father, Earl Webb, worked the line at a Ford plant in Hapeville for 23 years. Earl Webb had hands like tools, rough, precise, permanently stained with something that soap couldn't quite reach. He didn't talk much. He communicated in demonstrations. He'd pull Ronald into the garage on Saturday mornings and take apart an engine the way other fathers read bedtime stories. Piece by piece. Patient. Here's this part. Here's what it does. Here's why it matters. Here's what goes wrong when you ignore it. Earl Webb's philosophy of life fit in one sentence, delivered once and never repeated, because Earl Webb was not a man who repeated himself. If you understand what a machine is trying to tell you, the machine will never let you down. Ronald took that sentence into Georgia Tech, into 9 years of military service, into 3 combat zones, into a career spent listening to things that other people had stopped hearing. He graduated Georgia Tech with a 3.8 and a mechanical engineering degree and a minor in aerospace systems, and a reputation among his professors for being the student who asked the questions that came from somewhere they hadn't anticipated. Not difficult questions, precise ones. The kind that revealed whether the person asking had actually been thinking or just memorizing. He wasn't a star. He wasn't the smartest person in any room he entered. He was something rarer, someone who paid full attention to the thing in front of him, whatever that thing was, for as long as it required. The Army found uses for that. Aviation Maintenance Division, 2009, Fort Rucker for training, then Iraq, then Afghanistan, then places with longer silences and shorter supply chains, and the particular mathematics of keeping aircraft operational when the people who manufactured those aircraft were 9,000 miles away. And the sun was already coming up and the crew needed to be in the air before it did. His specialty, officially, was rotary wing aircraft systems maintenance. His actual specialty, the one that didn't have an official name, but that 3 different commanding officers had referenced in commendations, was seeing what wasn't visible yet, catching the fault before it became the failure, reading the pattern in the data the way his father had read the sound in an engine. Progressive fault diagnosis. The ability to look at something that was technically functioning and know, with the certainty that comes from years of watching things stop functioning at the worst possible moments, that it was going to stop. He earned 7 commendations in 9 years, 2 meritorious service medals. A citation that referenced in the dry language of military documentation, field improvisation under combat conditions, maintaining operational readiness of 2 UH-60 aircraft during extended zero visibility conditions. What that citation didn't say was that Ronald Webb had spent 14 straight hours keeping those aircraft operational using tools he'd fabricated himself and a diagnostic method he'd developed by trial and error, in conditions that did not allow for error, and that at the end of those 14 hours, both aircraft had flown, and everyone aboard had come home. He kept a notebook through all of it. Small, black cover. His name on the first page in permanent marker. R. Webby Beneath Observations. Every shift, every deployment, every time he noticed something worth noticing. Date, time, equipment code, description, assessment. Short, precise. No decoration. He'd filled 4 of them in 9 years. He was on his 2nd one at Holt Aerotech. Nobody knew about the notebooks. Sharon Webb had been a nurse at Grady Memorial. That's the short version. The longer version was that she was the kind of nurse patients asked for specifically by name when they were scared. She had a way of being present in a room that made the room feel less medical, less institutional, more like somewhere that contained a person who genuinely intended to help you. Ronald met her in 2013, during one of his leaves. She had the kind of laugh that made you want to say something funnier than you actually were, just to hear it again. They got married in 2014 at a small ceremony at a church in Mechanicsville that Sharon's grandmother had attended for 40 years. Brianna came in 2016. March of 2018, Sharon started losing weight without meaning to. By April, they knew what it was. Pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. By May, Ronald was back stateside. By November, Sharon was gone. Brianna was 2 years old. She wouldn't remember her mother except through photographs and the stories Ronald told her, which he was careful to make true. Ones. Not softened, not simplified. True. He talked about the laugh. He talked about the patients who asked for her by name. He talked about how she'd made their small apartment feel like the specific place you most wanted to be at the end of any given day. He didn't hide the grief from Brianna. He'd learned that hiding things from children who are paying close attention mostly just teaches them that grief is something to be hidden. He left the Armist in August 2018. Honorable discharge, no ceremony at his request. He joined Holt Aerotech in October. He requested the night shift specifically, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. The math was straightforward. Brianna started school at 8. He could drop her off, be home by 7:45, sleep from roughly 9 a.m. to 4 p.m., be awake when she got home at 3:30. He was there in the mornings. He was there in the afternoons. He was absent in the middle of the night when she was asleep. It was a calculation he'd made carefully. He would not be a father who was absent. That was the one thing he'd decided when Sharon died. Whatever else got harder or more complicated or more expensive, he would not be absent. He told Brianna stories about machines instead of fairy tales. She preferred them. He wasn't sure what that said about him as a father, and had eventually stopped worrying about it because she asked for them specifically, by name, the same way Sharon's patients had asked for her. She fell asleep before the stories ended most nights. He sat there for another 15 minutes anyway. The notebook entry from that night was 7 lines. Tuesday, 12:51 a.m. Bell 407 GXI prototype, hangar 3, pressure differential, turbine intake, pattern, 0.3% below spec, cycle approximately every 4 minutes. Not sensor malfunction consistent, non-random, increasing with ambient temperature. Physical obstruction probable. Particulate accumulation in pressure regulation chamber, based on pattern characteristics. If not addressed, functional at ground level, failure probable under load conditions within 3 to 4 weeks. He underlined the last part. Then he closed the notebook. Then he went home and made coffee and sat in the kitchen while Brianna slept and didn't think about the notebook and thought about the notebook. And finally, stopped trying to decide which of those things he was doing. In the morning, he dropped Brianna off at Carver Elementary. With her equipment box, she brought it every day, just in case the lab opened, and he drove home and he slept. And when he woke up, he called the district facilities office and left a message about the lighting situation as the school's STEM lab, and nobody called back, which was the same as every other time. He'd been calling for 4 weeks. Brianna Webb had a question she asked her father approximately once a week. The question changed every time because Brianna was 8 years old and had an appetite for questions that her teachers described in parent-teacher conferences as impressive and occasionally challenging to redirect. She asked questions about physics, about construction, about why certain roads were named after people who didn't seem to have done much. She asked questions about her mother, and Ronald answered those as carefully as he answered the technical ones, with the same commitment to being accurate rather than just comfortable. The question she asked the Tuesday night before the demonstration was different. She asked it in the car, while Ronald was driving her home from a study session at a classmate's house, holding her equipment box in her lap, looking out the window. "Ba, if our team can't practice right because we don't have a good space to work, does that mean we're not as good as the teams that do?" Ronald drove for a moment before answering. "No, it means you don't have the same resources." "That's a different problem." Brianna was quiet then. "But if we lose because we didn't have the same resources," Ronald kept his voice steady, "then you didn't lose because you weren't good enough. You lost because the system wasn't fair. Those are two completely separate things, and it matters that you don't confuse them." Brianna considered this. "How do you know which one it is?" He thought about 14 hours in the dark, about a makeshift diagnostic tool and 2 aircraft and a crew waiting. Because if you did everything you could with what you had, it's the system. If you didn't do everything you could with what you had, then you look at yourself first. Brianna's next question came softer. "Did you always do everything you could with what you had?" He thought about the crew that came home. "Not always. But I tried." Brianna nodded, held her equipment box a little tighter, looked back out the window. The lab had been closed for 4 weeks. The wiring problem was supposedly being assessed. The district facilities office was apparently in the business of not returning phone calls. And Brianna Webb's team had been building a robotics competition, entry on a kitchen table, under a fluorescent light that flickered when the refrigerator cycled on. She hadn't complained once. That cost Ronald something he didn't have a clean word for. He drove home, made her dinner, checked her notes on the robot's sensor calibration, which were more precise than a lot of maintenance logs he'd reviewed in his career. She fell asleep on the couch at 9:30, her notebook open on her chest, and he carried her to bed and stood in the doorway for a moment before going to get ready for his shift. 3 hours later, he was in the research hangar, looking at a pressure readout that was doing something it shouldn't. And he wrote it down, and he walked away, because some doors stay closed until circumstances force them open. And he'd been waiting long enough to know the difference between a door that needed forcing and one that needed time. This one needed time. He just didn't know how much. Sandra Holt was not an easy person to understand quickly. People tried. profiles in Atlanta Business Chronicle, a feature in Forbes that had used the phrase Iron CEO, CE in its subheadline, and which Sandra had clipped and kept not as a trophy, but as a reminder that she was operating in conditions where the description of a woman in her position would always be filtered through someone else's idea of what women in her position were supposed to be. She was 36. She had been CEO of Holt Aerotech for 6 years. Before that, the daughter of the founder who was simultaneously being prepared to lead and being protected from the full weight of what leading actually required, which turned out to be the one thing her father had gotten wrong about her preparation. Lawrence Holt had built the company from a 2-bay operation in Hapeville into a significant civilian aerospace manufacturer, and he had done it with the specific combination of technical knowledge, salesmanship, and willingness to work hours that other people considered unreasonable that characterized a certain generation of founder. He was 68 now, recovered from 2 strokes with the stubbornness of someone who had survived harder things, and he called Sandra every Sunday at 6 p.m., and those calls were the ones she never cancelled, regardless of what else was happening. Her mother, Carol, had died when Sandra was 11. Heart failure. Sudden. The kind of thing that doesn't allow for preparation or extended goodbye. Lawrence had not remarried. He had channeled what might have been grief into the company and into Sandra, and the results of that channeling were a company that survived its founder's health crisis and a daughter who was, in almost every professional metric, formidable. Miscos. The cost of formidable was something Sandra had mostly stopped accounting for. She lived alone. She ran 6 miles 3 mornings a week along the Beltline. She reviewed contract documents before most people had finished their first coffee. She had been described by a former board member she'd subsequently removed and as constitutionally incapable of small talk. She kept 3 numbers in her personal phone: Angela, her lawyer, and Lawrence's doctor. She didn't think of herself as cold. She thought of herself as efficient. She had learned, early and at some expense, that in the rooms she occupied, sentiment was read as weakness, hesitation was read as incompetence, and the only reliable currency was results. She had become very good at results. She had become less practiced at things that didn't produce results in measurable timeframes. She had one blind spot she hadn't fully identified yet. She believed that credentials were the primary evidence of capability. Not because she was dismissive of people without formal qualifications, she wasn't. Consciously, but because credentials had been the thing that gave her standing in rooms where her standing was otherwise contested. Her Duke MBA, her technical background, her demonstrable record. These were the things she'd used to build a case for herself when a case had needed to be built, and she had come to treat them as the primary signal to look for in others. That blind spot was about to cost her something, and then teach her something. In that order, the contract pressure was real and immediate. Holt Aerotech was finalizing negotiations on 8 Bell 407 GXI helicopters for MedFlight South, a medical transport company based in Houston, the largest single contract in the company's history at $47 million. The demonstration flight was scheduled for 2 p.m. on a Wednesday in September. Donald Spears, the longest-serving board member, had made comments in the last 2 quarterly meetings that were not quite ultimatums, but were close enough to them that Sandra had heard the structure underneath the words. Spears wanted to sell, had wanted to for 3 years. He was patient about it, because Spears was always patient, but patience was not the same as changed position. If MedFlight South signed, the company's valuation moved in a direction that made the acquisition argument harder. If MedFlight South walked, Spears had the votes. Sandra knew all of this. She carried it the way she carried most things without visibly carrying it. The weight was real. The posture was straight. The night shift at Holt Aerotech had its own ecosystem. Not the daytime ecosystem, the one with department meetings and badge lanyards, and the particular social architecture of a 300-person aerospace firm, where everyone was constantly performing competence for an audience. The night shift was smaller, 8 people, most nights. George Price and one other guard. 2 maintenance techs who covered the manufacturing floor. A quality control rep who worked remotely and occasionally wandered through. Ronald. They had a rhythm. George brought the thermos. Ronald provided the cups, which were technically property of the break room, but had been informally reassigned. They met in the small utility room near Gate 4, somewhere between 3 and 3:30 a.m., depending on how the floors were going, and they sat on mismatched chairs and drank coffee, and talked about the things that get talked about at 3 in the morning in places where nobody else is watching. George Price had spent 8 years on the USS Gerald R. Ford. He'd seen things that had recalibrated his sense of what mattered and what didn't. Which was one of the things he and Ronald had in common, without ever having to say so out loud. He knew Ronald had been military from the first month, not from anything, Ronald said. From the way he moved through spaces that contained equipment. There was a quality of attention in it, a specific orientation toward objects and systems that you developed when the objects and systems in question were the difference between someone coming home or not. George had asked once, early on, direct the way only someone who'd served could be direct about it. What were you before this? Ronald kept it simple. Technician. George pushed slightly. What kind? And Ronald gave him the answer that was true without being elaborate. The kind where you know a lot but don't talk about it much. George had let it go. He was not a person who pushed. 6 years later, he was still not a person who pushed, but he was a person who had spent 6 years watching his friend move through a building where nobody saw him and had developed opinions about what that cost. He kept those opinions to himself. Right up until the morning of the demonstration, when Timothy Nash's team had been working on a Bell 4007 for 3 hours and the demo was at 2 p.m. And Sandra Holt had the expression on her face that George had seen on commanding officers before. And that meant something is going to break if this doesn't change. George pulled out his phone. Ronald picked up on the second ring. George kept it simple. You're not on shift, Ronald. I know, George. Bell 407 prototypes won't start. Demo at 2 p.m. They've had 5 engineers on it for 3 hours, and they've got nothing. The pause lasted about 4 seconds. George had counted pauses long enough to know that 4 seconds, for Ronald Webb, was the equivalent of a much longer internal conversation. Then, Ronald said, I'll be there by 10:30. George set his phone down, looked at the closed hangar door, thought about 6 years of 3 in the morning coffee, and the notebook he'd never read, and the things you know about a person without knowing them, in any way, you could explain to someone else. Sometimes you know. You just know. Timothy Nash Holt Aerotech's chief engineer, MIT, 11 years with the company, had been working on the Bell 407 since 7 a.m. He had 4 of his engineers with him. They had laptops and diagnostic cables and reference manuals and the specific energy of people who are very good at what they do and are currently confronting evidence that what they do has limits they hadn't anticipated. By 11:30, Timothy found Sandra in the hangar. She'd been there for 20 minutes, standing at a distance that said, I am here without being in your way, and also said, in a different register, I am watching. Timothy's voice was careful, the careful of someone accustomed to precision, who is currently dealing with imprecision. Diagnostics are clean across all systems. We've run 3 full cycles. The ignition sequence initiates and stops. Everything the system can measure is within spec. Sandra looked at him. The aircraft won't start. Timothy, correct. Sandra, again. The system says everything is fine. Timothy, correct. One more time, flat and final. And the aircraft won't start. Timothy heard the 3rd iteration for what it was. We're continuing to work through the possibilities. Sandra's voice didn't change register, but carried everything that needed carrying. We have 2.5 hours. Timothy went back to the helicopter. Sandra stayed where she was. And that was when the side door of the hangar opened, and a man in a grey hoodie and dark jeans walked in, and everything that came next began. Ronald Webb was not supposed to be there. He knew that. He'd known it when George called him. He'd known it when he drove to Holt Aerotech in his own car on his own time in civilian clothes, with no badge for this section and no authorization for any of it. But here's what nobody in that room could have known. The man who just walked in through the side door in a grey hoodie, no badge, not on the schedule, had once kept Army helicopters flying in a sandstorm, so thick you couldn't see 10 feet ahead, with no power tools, no computer, nothing but his hands and what 9 years had put in his head. He stood near the side door and looked at the Bell 407. Not the engineers around it, not the laptops and the cables. The aircraft, his head tilted slightly to the left. The automatic repositioning of someone who is trying to hear something through their eyes. Stephanie Monroe saw him first. She was 28, Georgia Tech, 18 months at Holt Aerotech, and she had the particular alertness of someone new enough to still be noticing things that experienced people had learned to filter out. She recognized Ronald from the building. Her question was genuine, not confrontational. "Mr. Webb? You're not on shift today?" Timothy Nash turned around. He looked at Ronald the way people look at things that don't fit the category they've mentally assigned to a space. Not unfriendly. Categorically confused. "This section is restricted access." Ronald kept his voice level. "I know. I just want to look for a minute, Timothy." "Look at what, Ronald?" "The aircraft." A pause. Timothy opened his mouth. Then Sandra's voice came from behind both of them. "Let him look." She had walked over. She was standing 10 feet away. Timothy turned toward her. "Sandra, we have protocol." Sandra's voice was flat in the way that meant she'd moved past the point where raising it would add anything. "I know what we have, Timothy. We also have a demonstration in 2.5 hours and an aircraft that won't start." "Let him look." Timothy stepped back. Ronald walked toward the Bell 407. He went around it once, not quickly, not with any visible urgency. He moved the way, he moved in the hangar, on the nights when he paused at something and his brain engaged in the specific gear that most of his brain stayed out of during mop pushes and trash can rounds. His right hand touched the fuselage at 3 points. Not a mechanical check. Habit. The reflex of someone who has learned that machines communicate through surfaces as much as through readouts. He stopped at the turbine intake, pulled his phone out, turned on the flashlight, crouched down, aimed the light into the intake and held it there. 5 seconds. 10. 15. He stood up. Metallic particulate buildup in the pressure regulation chamber, not a theory. A finding. It's not showing on diagnostics because it's a physical obstruction, not a sensor issue. You need to pull the valve housing and clean the interior surfaces manually. The compressor intake will need to be checked as well. If you don't do both, the aircraft will probably start fine on the ground but will fail under load conditions within 72 hours of flight. The hangar processed this. Stephanie Monroe had stopped writing. Timothy Nash was quiet for a moment that was more informative than the words that followed it. "We ran a full system purge this morning. Standard protocol." Ronald's response was immediate and without heat. "Not deep enough. The particulate is fine enough to pass through standard purge cycles. It accumulates on the interior regulation surfaces over time. It's a physical problem. Needs physical access to fix." Timothy tried again. "And you know this how?" Ronald looked at him, then looked at Sandra. Sandra had moved closer. She was 7 feet away. Her expression hadn't changed in any way that was easy to catalogue. But something in the quality of her attention had shifted. She was looking at Ronald Webb in the specific way you look at something when you've decided to actually see it rather than just observe it. "If I give you access to this aircraft, and you're wrong, you lose this job. No severance, no reference." Ronald met her eyes. "I know, Sandra. If you're right, name it. 12 people in that hangar, every one of them waiting." Ronald Webb looked at Sandra Holt for a moment that lasted slightly longer than a moment. Then he looked at the aircraft, then back at her. He thought about a kitchen table with a flickering fluorescent light, about an equipment box carried to school every morning just in case, about a question asked in a car at night. "I'll tell you when I'm done," he said. "I need my tools. They're in my truck." The truck was a 2016 Ford F-150. He kept it clean inside, organized. The back seat had Brianna's booster seat on the right and a stacking set of plastic bins that held her various project components, organized by type because she'd asked him to help her organize them that way, and he had. One Saturday afternoon, with the same method he'd used to organize equipment for a deployment. The cargo hold had one thing under the cargo mat: olive green canvas bag, military issue cut, civilian procurement, zipper worn at one end from years of opening and closing in conditions that were not gentle on zippers. His name was stenciled on the side in black paint that had faded to a particular shade of gray that was the visual equivalent of well used. George Price had followed him out. Standing at the corner of the building, not saying anything, Ronald unclipped the cargo mat, lifted the bag. George's voice was quiet, not a question. "You kept it, Ronald. Never had a good enough reason to get rid of it, George, or you knew." Ronald didn't answer that. He lifted the bag onto his shoulder. It settled the way things settle when they've been carried in a particular position enough times to remember it. He walked back toward the hangar. Inside the bag, torque wrenches in 4 sizes, precision screwdrivers, flathead and Phillips military spec, a digital pressure gauge he'd bought himself in 2011 and had calibrated every year since. Aviation-grade solvent, microfiber cloths, 4 of them, folded to the same dimensions. A small fiber optic inspection camera he'd purchased from a retiring technician for $200 in 2018 and had never found a reason to regret. Every object wrapped in its own cloth, every object in its designated pocket. The bag opened and the tools were where they always were, and his hands went to them, the way hands go to things they've found 1,000 times in the dark. He set the bag on the floor of the hangar, opened it. The tools caught the halogen light. Stephanie Monroe looked at the bag, then at Ronald. There was something in her expression that wasn't quite recognition, but was adjacent to it, the beginning of a reclassification happening in real time. Her voice shifted register slightly. Where did these come from, Ronald? Army. Most of them. A few I bought when I got out. She looked at the fiber optic camera. I've never seen anyone use one of those for an intake inspection. Ronald picked up the torque wrench. Most people don't know it works. I figured it out in conditions where I needed it to work. He walked to the Bell 407 and started engine cowling. 6 bolts. Each one torqued out in a specific sequence to prevent housing warp. He worked without announcing each step, without narrating, without asking permission for the next action. Timothy Nash stood at a distance and watched. Not the way he'd watched at the beginning. Something had shifted. Timothy Nash was an engineer. He recognized methodology when he saw it, regardless of the context in which it was appearing. What he was watching was methodology. Specific, calibrated, the methodology of someone who had opened this class of engine, or something very close to it. Enough times that the process had become autonomous, and the consciousness behind it was free to focus on what the process was revealing, rather than on executing the process itself. By the time the cowling came off 8 minutes after Ronald started, the pieces set on a clean cloth he'd pulled from the bag, Timothy Nash had stopped processing this as an intrusion and started processing it as something else. Stephanie Monroe was writing. Not form completion. Notes. Sandra Holt stood at a distance that could be interpreted as professional observation, and was something more personal than that. Ronald pulled the valve housing at 12:19 p.m. He carried it to a workbench, set it down, opened it. The interior surfaces were coated with a fine metallic film, gray-silver. Barely visible under the overhead lights, unless you knew to look for it, and were looking at the right angle. He looked at it for 3 seconds. Then, quietly, to no one in particular, to the machine almost. There it is. Timothy walked to the workbench, looked at the valve housing interior, was silent for a count of 5. His question was genuine. Why didn't the purge cycle pick this up? Ronald was already applying solvent to the first microfiber cloth. Purge cycles are designed for liquid contamination and larger particulate. This is submicron metallic dust. It passes through the filtration and settles on regulation surfaces over time. The only way to find it is to open the component and look at the physical surfaces directly. Diagnostics can't see it because diagnostics are measuring system performance, not surface condition. It's a gap in the protocol. Not an error. A gap. Timothy absorbed this. Where does the particulate come from? Ronald worked as he answered. Brake and bearing wear in the adjacent assemblies. Accumulates slowly. Takes months to become a problem. This aircraft has been in active test cycling for at least 3 months by my estimate, the solvent went on. The cloth moved across the interior surfaces. The gray-silver film began to yield. At 1:14 p.m., Ronald finished the compressor intake, the harder access, the one that required reaching into a space designed for airflow rather than human arms, working entirely by feel with the vacuum probe. His shoulder aching from the angle, his face turned away from the component because there was no way to see it directly, and he didn't need to. When he pulled his arm out, the vacuum canister held a visible layer of fine metallic dust. He said quietly, to nobody. That's most of it. He began reassembly. 12 connections in the electrical harness, each one tagged with tape when he'd removed it, each one restored in sequence. The valve housing, the hydraulic lines, the sensor array, the cowling, each bolt torqued in sequence. At 1:43 p.m., he stepped back. He was sweating. His right shoulder would be stiff by the time he drove home. There was grease on his forearms and a smear of solvent on his left wrist, and he had not said an unnecessary word in 2 hours and 2 minutes. He looked at the aircraft, then at Sandra. "Try it now." Sandra Holt climbed into the cockpit of the Bell 407 GXI at 1:44 p.m. The hangar was very quiet. The ventilation system hummed. Someone's tablet produced a notification sound that nobody moved to silence. She reached for the ignition. The starter motor engaged. The turbine began to spin, slowly, then with more intention. The rotor blades moved, and the movement produced a sound that was the specific sound of a machine finding its functional state after a period of not being in it. The engine caught, smooth, even, carrying the right authority. The Bell 407 GXI lifted 8 inches off the hangar floor, held there in a hover that was textbook in its stability, and came back down. Sandra shut off the engine. The rotors slowed, stopped. The hangar was quiet again. She climbed out of the cockpit, walked across the hangar floor. Stopped 4 feet from Ronald Webb, who was wiping his hands on a cloth and watching her approach with an expression that was not pride and was not relief. It was the expression of someone who has done the thing that needed doing and is now waiting to see what comes next. Impressive. Her voice was level. "What do you want?" And Ronald Webb looked at Sandra Holt and said the thing that nobody in that hangar had been prepared for. "The STEM lab at Carver Elementary in Vine City. The one with the electrical problem that's been keeping it closed for 4 weeks. My daughter is on a robotics team that's been working on a kitchen table because they can't get into their workspace." He held her gaze. "Steady. Not asking for sympathy. Asking for action. You have phone numbers I don't have. You can make a call I can't make. That's what I want. That's all I want." The hangar absorbed this. Stephanie Monroe did not write anything down. Timothy Nash lowered his tablet to his side. George Price, standing near the door where he'd positioned himself without being asked, looked at the floor. He had heard many things in 6 years of 3 a.m. conversations. He had not heard this. He thought later that he should have expected it. He hadn't. Which meant he'd known what Ronald was capable of with a machine, but hadn't fully known what Ronald was capable of as a person. Sandra Holt looked at Ronald Webb for a count of 4. Then, done. She didn't offer further elaboration. She turned, and her voice carried across the hangar floor. "Angela." Angela Cole appeared. Sandra did not slow down. "Get me the director of facilities for Atlanta Public Schools. Today." In the next hour, Angela was already on her phone. Sandra walked toward her office, and the door opened, and she went through it, and Ronald Webb stood in the center of a very quiet hangar with grease on his arms and a tool bag on the floor beside him. And the expression of a man who has just made an exchange he considers entirely fair. He started packing his tools, one by one, each wrapped in its cloth. Each returned to its pocket. Behind him, Timothy Nash spoke. Not confrontationally. The genuine question of someone trying to understand, where did you actually learn to do that? Ronald didn't look up from the bag. Army, 9 years, Timothy, rotary wing. Ronald, maintenance. Specialty in progressive fault diagnosis. I've seen that particulate pattern before. Takes a while to recognize. Once you've seen it, you don't miss it. Timothy was quiet for a moment. Then, we should have caught this in the protocol. Ronald looked at him directly for the first time in their conversation. The protocol is good. It just doesn't cover physical surface inspection without specific trigger criteria. That's a gap, not a failure. Your diagnostic cycles are solid. This just needed eyes on the physical component. Machines tell you what they can measure. Sometimes the problem is in the space between measurements. Timothy Nash nodded, slowly, but he nodded. Ronald picked up his bag, lifted it onto his shoulder, walked toward the side door. He pushed it open. The September light came through. He walked to his truck, put the bag in the trunk, covered it with the cargo mat, and sat in the driver's seat for a moment before starting the engine. He thought about Brianna, about the lab, about one phone call that he couldn't make. He thought about his father, who had said that if you understand what a machine is trying to tell you, the machine will never let you down. And he thought about how long it had taken him to understand that the principle extended further than machines. That people were trying to tell you things all the time. That the question was always whether you were listening. The truck pulled out of the parking lot, and the September sky over Atlanta was clear and enormous, the way Atlanta skies get in the hour after the morning haze burns off. He drove through it with the window down and the radio off, and the particular quiet of a man who has just done the thing he knew how to do, and is not sure yet what comes next, and is, for now, okay with not knowing. Sandra Holt did not go straight to her office. She went to the observation window first, the one on the second floor of the engineering wing that looked down into the main hangar. She stood there for 4 minutes with her arms at her sides and watched the Bell 407 GXI sitting quiet and functional below her. And she thought about the fact that 5 engineers with a combined 80 years of credentialed experience had produced 3 hours of nothing, and 1 man with a canvas bag had produced 2 hours and 13 minutes of result. The math was not complicated. The implications were, then she went to her office, closed the door, sat down, didn't open her laptop, didn't look at the afternoon's schedule, just sat, which was something Sandra Holt almost never did, because sitting without purpose felt to her like a position statement she hadn't approved. But she sat, because something had shifted in the past 3 hours and she needed to locate exactly what it was before she could move forward in any direction that made sense. Angela knocked at 2:08 p.m., came in with a phone log and the particular expression she wore when she had both good news and something adjacent to bad news and was calculating how to sequence them. Medflight South confirmed. Their team is on site. Director of Facilities for Atlanta Public Schools, I have him on hold. He's been waiting 11 minutes and he sounded genuinely nervous. Sandra took the phone without looking up. Good. Give me 3 minutes with him. Then I want the personnel file for Ronald Webb. Employee ID 38847. Angela's expression shifted by approximately 2 millimeters. Not surprise, recognition. She left without asking why. Sandra put the phone to her ear. This is Sandra Holt. We need to talk about Carver Elementary and a STEM lab that's been closed for a month. The conversation lasted 6 minutes. The director of facilities used phrases like we've been assessing the situation and resource allocation timelines. And I understand your concern. Sandra used phrases like today and before 6 p.m. and I don't need you to assess it, I need it fixed. When the call ended, the lab would have electricians on site within 90 minutes. Angela had already confirmed that before Sandra set the phone down. Sandra put the phone down, looked at the ceiling, thought, 1 phone call. He's been making calls for 4 weeks and nobody picked up. 1 call from me and it's happening in 90 minutes. That was a specific kind of uncomfortable thought. The kind that, once it arrived, couldn't be asked to leave, because it meant the problem was never the problem. The problem was access. The problem was which voice got heard in which room, and she had been sitting in the rooms with the voices that got heard for so long that she'd stopped thinking about what it meant to be outside them. Angela came back with a thin printed file. Sandra read it at her desk while the Medflight South demonstration was happening on the floor below her, while a $47 million deal was confirming itself, while the Bell 407 GAXE that Ronald Webb had fixed in 2 hours and 13 minutes was demonstrating exactly the performance characteristics that Holt Aerotech had been promising for 18 months. She read, Education, Georgia Tech, Mechanical Engineering, 3.8 GPA, minor in aerospace systems. The kind of transcript that in a different application would have put him in a room with Timothy Nash rather than in a room adjacent to it. Military service, 9 years. Warrant officer, Aviation Maintenance Division. The specialty line read, Rotary Wing Aircraft Systems Maintenance, Progressive Fault Diagnosis. And then the commendations listed in the dry, sequential language of military records that treats extraordinary things as line items. 2 meritorious service medals, an Army Commendation Medal, a special citation. She read it twice. Field improvisation, under combat conditions, maintaining operational readiness of 2 UH-60 aircraft during extended, zero visibility conditions. No further detail. Military citations never gave further detail. They assumed you could extrapolate. Sandra could extrapolate. She looked at the employment start date, October 2018, 6 years ago, and then the position, night custodian, and then the reason for military separation, which the form had space for, and which Ronald had filled with 2 words, family. She sat with that for a moment. Then she looked at the bottom of the file where her HR system kept notes. There was one entry, 3 weeks old, from the security log, employee removed from restricted research wing per CEO directive. And then, appended later she could see, it was a later edition because Angela had flagged it with a timestamp, a transcript from the hallway camera audio. Ronald's voice. Recorded without context, in a corridor at 1:18 a.m., 3 weeks ago. Directed at George Price. Someone needs to look at the pressure readout on that screen. 3 weeks ago. He had seen it 3 weeks ago. He had said so to the only person within earshot, and the only person within earshot had no mechanism to pass it anywhere meaningful. And the problem had been sitting there for 3 weeks, getting incrementally worse, until the morning of the most consequential demonstration in the company's recent history. Sandra closed the file, put both hands flat on the desk. I had him removed from the room, not because he'd done anything wrong. Because he was standing near equipment. He shouldn't have been near us, and she'd processed that as a category unauthorized personnel in restricted space and acted on the category rather than on what was actually in front of her, which was a man who had seen something real and had no way to say so. The discomfort of that was different from most discomfort Sandra experienced. Business discomfort had edges she knew how to find. This discomfort was more diffuse. It occupied the space between what she'd assumed and what had been true, and that space was larger than she'd expected. Angela, she pressed the intercom. Yes? Pull any available security footage from the research hangar. The past month. I want anything that shows Ronald Webb in the common areas near the prototype bay. A pause. All of it? All of it. There were 4 clips that Angela had flagged. The most recent one from 3 weeks ago she'd already read the audio from. But Angela had also pulled something older, 6 months ago. A maintenance technician named Darryl had slipped near a catwalk in the secondary production area. He'd caught a sharp edge on the way down, cut his palm significantly. The camera had caught everything, and it had caught Ronald Webb, who'd been in the adjacent section with his cart, arriving within 45 seconds of the incident. She watched him help Darryl to his feet, watched him look at the cut with the assessment of someone who had seen injuries before and was deciding whether this required a medical station or could be managed on site. Medical station. Apparently he walked Darryl toward the first aid room, one hand at the man's shoulder, not gripping, just present. She could see, in the low-resolution footage, Ronald handing Darryl something. The work order annotation Angela had added said, per technician Darryl's account, Webb gave him half his lunch. Sandra watched this clip twice. Not because it was dramatic, because it was unremarkable, because Ronald Webb had helped a co-worker who'd been hurt and given him food and walked him to the nurse's station and returned to work without logging an incident report with his own name on it, or telling anyone, or seeking anything from it. She wasn't sure why she found that so significant. She turned it over for a while, the way she turned over problems she was still finding the shape of. He doesn't do things for what he gets back. That was part of it. She operated in an environment where almost every action had a visible intended return. She wasn't cynical about this. It was simply how large organizations functioned. You built goodwill. You established reciprocity. You positioned. Ronald Webb appeared to operate according to a different ledger entirely. He'd fixed the helicopter not for recognition, not for a promotion or a reference, or even apparently for money. For lights. For his daughter's workshop lights. Sandra sat with that for a long time after the office had emptied and Atlanta had shifted from late afternoon into early evening outside her window. The MedFlight South team signed a letter of intent at 4:47 p.m. Timothy Nash sent Sandra a text at 4:52 that said simply, "They're happy. Demo was clean. Mechanical performance exactly as spec'd." He did not reference the morning. Timothy Nash was not the kind of person who referenced things he was still processing. Sandra was at her desk when the letter came through. She reviewed it, sent it to legal, notified the board via Angela. Donald Spears would see it by morning. Then she closed her laptop and sat in her office, alone, and looked at the Atlanta. skyline, and thought about a man she'd walked past for 6 years without seeing. And she thought about all the things she'd walked past without seeing. And she thought, that's the real gap. Not in the protocol. In me. Ronald drove to Kroger at 3:15. Rotisserie chicken, sweet potatoes. Brianna's particular brand of fruit juice that came in the small plastic bottles she liked because they fit in her bag. He was in the self-checkout line when his phone buzzed. A number he didn't recognize. Atlanta area code. He answered. The director of facilities for Atlanta Public Schools introduced himself. Used language like we've prioritized this repair and electricians are on site as of this afternoon. Said the lab would be operational by morning. Ronald stood at the self-checkout with a rotisserie chicken under one arm and said, simply, thank you. Then he stood there for a moment after he'd hung up. The checkout machine said, please place item in bagging area in the patient voice of a machine that had said this 10,000 times and would say it 10,000 more. He placed the chicken in the bagging area. He thought, one phone call. And then he thought, she actually did it. And then he thought, of course she did. She said she would, which was maybe the most complicated part, because he'd half expected it not to happen. Not because he thought Sandra Holt was dishonest. Because he'd learned, at some cost over the years, that the gap between what people intended and what they followed through on was real and wide, and not always bridged by good intentions. But it had happened. He drove home. Made dinner. Brianna came in from her afternoon robotics session, at a classmate's house looking the specific kind of tired that 8-year-olds look when they've been intensely focused for 3 hours. She dropped her bag, dropped into her chair at the kitchen table and looked at the chicken. Ronald set a plate in front of her. Good day? Brianna picked up a fork. Okay. Tyler's soldering iron is worse than mine, which is hard because mine is already bad. Ronald kept his voice even. Lab's going to be open tomorrow. She looked up. And her face did the thing it did sometimes, the thing that went very still for a second before everything else happened. Are you serious? Ronald. Electricians were there this afternoon. The stillness broke. She made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a breath and put her fork down and said, with the gravity of someone 3 times her age, I knew it was going to work out. I kept telling Marcus it was going to work out and he didn't believe me. Ronald served himself some sweet potato. Brianna looked at him with the particular expression she'd developed over 8 years of having a father who sometimes answered questions with less information than she'd asked for. Bah. How did it happen? Did the district actually fix it? Ronald. Someone made a call, Brianna. Who? Ronald. Someone who had the right number, she studied him. The Sharon inherited quality that could make a look feel like a full interrogation. Was it you, Ronald? I didn't make the call, Brianna, but you made something happen. Ronald looked at his daughter across the kitchen table. Eat your sweet potato, Brianna, who was 8, and therefore not satisfied with this answer but also 8, and therefore willing to defer it for later, ate her sweet potato after she was in bed. Ronald washed the dishes and stood at the sink looking at the dark yard through the window and thought about the morning. About what it had felt like to reach into that engine. About the specific sensation of returning to a version of himself that he'd kept in a canvas bag under a cargo mat for 6 years, not gone, just stored. He'd thought, when he left the army, that he was closing something, sealing it. The engineering identity, the technical self, the person who could look at a broken system and see the path from broken to functional. He'd thought he was putting that away in order to become the person Brianna needed. He hadn't understood until today that the two people might not be mutually exclusive. He dried the dishes, went to bed at 10 p.m., set his alarm for 10:30 p.m., didn't sleep. At 11:47 p.m., standing in the custodial supply room lacing up his work boots, Ronald found an email notification on his phone from Sandra Holt, CEO Holt Aerotech, sent at 8:33 p.m. Subject line, meeting request Thursday 9 a.m. Body Mr. Webb. I'd like to meet at your earliest convenience regarding your role here at Holt Aerotech. Please confirm. He read it. Read it again. Put the phone in his pocket. Finished lacing his boots. walked out to the floor. George was at the gate, thermos in hand, with the expression of someone who has been waiting to see a specific person's face. You see the email? Ronald. Yeah, George. What do you think it is? Ronald. Don't know yet. George. You worried? Ronald took the thermos, poured a cup into the lid. I did the right thing. Whatever she decides, I did the right thing. George looked at him for a moment. There were things George Price had never said to Ronald Webb that he had been thinking for 6 years. And standing here at midnight with the halogen lights and the empty hangar and the Bell 407 GXI sitting quietly in its bay behind them, he came close to saying some of them. Instead, he said, "Mop's still squeaking." Ronald looked at the cart. "Left rear wheel." "I know, George. You reported it twice." Ronald. "I know, George. I could put in a work order." Ronald. "Third time's the charm." George smiled. "Go clean something." Ronald went to clean something. Thursday morning, Sandra Holt arrived at Holt Aerotech at 7:15, which was normal. She reviewed 2 contracts, responded to 14 emails, and declined a breakfast meeting request from Donald Spears, who had sent a congratulatory note about MedFlight South that managed to be warm and surveillance adjacent simultaneously. At 8:47, Angela brought in 2 cups of coffee and said, he confirmed. 9 o'clock, Sandra. Thank you, Angela. Is there anything I should, Sandra? No. A pause. Then more evenly. Thank you, Angela. Angela left. Sandra sat at her desk and thought about what she was going to say, and in what order and whether the order mattered, which was something she thought about before every significant conversation. Usually the answer was, yes, the order matters, and here is the correct order. This morning the answer was, I'm not sure. She wasn't sure because the usual frameworks didn't quite fit. This wasn't a negotiation. It wasn't a performance review. It wasn't discipline or recognition in any conventional sense. It was something she'd been trying to categorize since the previous afternoon and hadn't fully managed. At 8:59, Angela's voice came through the intercom. Mr. Webb is here, Sandra. Send him in. Ronald wore dark slacks and a white button-down. His clothes were clean and pressed and had the quality of something worn for a specific purpose rather than out of habit. He carried nothing. Sat down when Sandra gestured toward the chair across from her desk. 2 cups of coffee between them. He didn't move toward his. Sandra looked at him. He looked back. Neither of them started immediately, which was unusual for Sandra and appeared to not bother Ronald at all. I want to apologize first. She said it the way she said things she'd decided to say directly, without pre-hedging. 3 weeks ago, I had security remove you from the research wing because you were standing near equipment in a restricted area. You'd noticed something real. You tried to say something. I didn't give you the opportunity to say it. That was wrong. Ronald was quiet for a moment. You didn't know who I was. Sandra didn't soften it. That's a reason. It's not an excuse. She held his gaze. Yesterday in the hangar, the offer I made you was poorly framed. The condition I attached to it, your job on the line, that was a way of controlling a situation that made me uncomfortable, and I dressed it up as leverage. I'm aware of what it actually was. He absorbed this. You still let me try, Sandra. I was out of options. There's no softening on it. She was not offering herself grace she hadn't earned. I want to be honest about that. Ronald picked up his coffee cup, set it back down without drinking. What does this meeting accomplish? Sandra slid the envelope across the desk. He opened it, read it. His expression moved through something not surprise exactly, more like the careful examination of an object he'd expected to be one shape and found was another. Senior test engineer. The salary was exactly 3 times what his current classification paid. Benefits. A signing bonus. He set it down. I can't take it. Sandra had anticipated this. Why? Ronald's answer came without hesitation. Because Brianna gets out of school at 3, and the engineering schedule doesn't actually allow for that. Not when there's a deadline, not when there's a prototype issue, not when a client needs something yesterday. I know how those jobs work. I've watched them work from the outside for 6 years. He looked at her steadily. On paper, the schedule is flexible. In practice, it isn't. And Brianna is not a practice problem. She had prepared 2 responses to anticipated objections. This was the anticipated objection. She started to offer the first response. Ronald was still talking. I want 2 things. He wasn't asking. He wasn't nervous. He was doing what he'd done in the hangar, stating what he'd determined to be true. A formal channel to report what I observe. Not informal, not optional, something that actually goes somewhere. I go through Hangar 3 twice a night. I see things your engineers see once a week, or once a month, or never, because they're not here at 2 in the morning. That's worth something, he paused, and a wage that reflects the actual value of that. I'm not asking for the engineering salary. I'm asking for honesty about what I contribute. Sandra looked at him across the desk, and she thought, with a clarity she hadn't expected, this is the most direct conversation I've had in this building in years. Not because it was hostile, because it was exactly what it was. No positioning, no managing of impression, no gap between what he meant and what he said. Done, she said. Both, Ronald. That's it? Sandra, that's it. She looked at him. You could have asked for more. Ronald picked up his coffee. I know what I need. The rest is extra. Sandra Holt, who had negotiated 8-figure contracts, who had argued before boards and lawyers and federal regulators, who had spent 15 years in rooms where every word was an instrument, sat across from a night custodian in dark slacks and a white button-down who had just declined a $138 Susan job offer in favor of a reporting channel and a fair wage, and she found herself at a genuine loss for the next sentence, which was, in her experience, approximately never. She recovered in 3 seconds. 3 seconds was longer than usual. She noted that, after Ronald left, she stood at the window again. The same window, the same hangar below. The Bell 407 GXI in its bay. Post-maintenance covers on, quiet and functional. She thought about the file. About 2 words in a reason for separation field. Family. She thought about a man who had 7 commendations and a notebook nobody knew about, and had spent 6 years choosing to be exactly where his daughter needed him to be, at exactly the cost that required. She thought, I've spent 6 years measuring people by what they could prove on paper. And the most valuable person in this building has been proving things on a floor I barely walk on. The thought was uncomfortable. She kept it anyway. Useful things often were. Stephanie Monroe found Ronald in the supply room at 11:50 p.m. the following Friday. She'd been thinking about the notebook since Wednesday. Not the observation itself, the methodology. About the specific approach of treating a large operational environment as a system to be observed rather than a series of tasks to be completed. About what 6 years of that kind of observation might contain. She knocked on the open door. Ronald looked up from where he was checking his supply inventory, which he organized with a precision that should have been invisible because supply inventories are not things most people notice, but which Stephanie had started noticing the week before when she'd been in the hangar at 1 a.m. to retrieve a document and had passed through the supply room and registered that everything in it was organized by type and frequency of use and labeled in handwriting that was small and consistent and completely legible. The notebook, she said. Ronald looked at her. You said you had one, Ronald. I do, Stephanie. Have you thought about it? He went to his locker, opened it, took out the black notebook with his name on the first page and set it on the workbench between them. Stephanie opened it, read in silence. She was a careful reader, the kind of reader who slows down when something matters rather than when something is confusing. She slowed down on the 3rd page, slowed down again on the 7th. On the 19th, a cluster of entries spanning 14 months, she stopped. Ronald. She looked up. There are 4 entries in here about pressure patterns in the Bell 407 series. Going back 14 months, Ronald. I know, Stephanie. Nobody else has this information, Ronald. Nobody asked. Not bitterness, just accuracy. I want to write a technical analysis with you. Direct. No pre-hedging. Physical fault diagnosis in rotary wing aircraft. Your methodology is the subject. Case studies from these entries. Journal of Aviation Maintenance. You'd be first author. He looked at her. Timothy doesn't have a problem with that, Stephanie. Timothy suggested it, a pause. Something passed across Ronald's expression, not quite surprise, more like a recalibration. A small one. Let me think about it, he said. He said it the same way he'd said it before. Stephanie Monroe, who had a memory for how people said things, recognized the repetition and recognized something else in it. Both times, the answer wasn't no. She closed the notebook, handed it back, looked at him for a moment with the directness of someone who has made a professional assessment and is willing to state it plainly. You've been doing research for 6 years, Ronald. You just haven't had anywhere to send it. He looked at the notebook in his hand. It wasn't research. It was observation, Stephanie. What's the difference? Ronald thought about this for a genuine moment. Research is looking for something specific. Observation is paying attention to what's there. She nodded slowly. The paper needs both. What you have is both. He put the notebook back in his locker, closed it. Thursday, he said, 11:55 p.m. I'll be here, Stephanie. I'll be here too. The weekly observation report started the following Monday. 2 pages. Filed through a form that Angela Cole had set up in the internal system at Sandra's instruction. Stephanie Monroe received them. She responded within 48 hours, always with at least one technical question, and frequently with 2. The questions were specific. They required specific answers. Ronald wrote those answers in the same voice he wrote the notebook, short, precise. No decoration, and the answers were good enough that by the 3rd week, Stephanie was forwarding them to Timothy, with a note that said simply, "Read this before Friday's maintenance review." Timothy read them. All of them. He didn't say anything to Ronald about it directly for 2 weeks. Then he knocked on the supply room door at 7:08 a.m. on a Tuesday, 3 minutes after Ronald's shift ended, and 1 minute before Ronald would have been in the parking lot. Ronald was putting his notebook in his locker. He turned around. Timothy stood in the doorway, with his badge in his hand, and the expression of someone who has been thinking about how to start a sentence, and hasn't quite landed on it. He was wearing a button-down instead of his usual technical vest, which meant he'd come in before his normal start time specifically for this. "I read the draft you and Stephanie put together," he said. Ronald waited. The methodology section, the field observation framework. "I've been doing this for 11 years and I've never seen that approach written down systematically. I've seen parts of it, elements of it, in different places, but not assembled like that." Ronald closed his locker. It took 9 years to develop, and 6 more to apply somewhere that didn't involve people's lives on the line. So it came out cleaner. Timothy absorbed this. The statement contained information he hadn't had before, not the broad fact of Ronald's military service, which Sandra had shared in a brief summary with the engineering leads, but the experiential weight behind the method. "I owe you an apology," Timothy said. Flat. Direct. The apology of an engineer who has concluded that an apology is accurate rather than merely appropriate. "When you walked into the hangar that morning, I treated you as a category problem before I treated you as a person." Ronald looked at him. "You let me look at the aircraft, Timothy." "Sandra told me to." "Ronald, you could have pushed back harder." Timothy was quiet for a moment. "I could have. I didn't." He looked up. "Luckily for all of us," Ronald picked up his bag. "The protocol gap isn't a failure, Timothy. It's an oversight. Clean up the physical surface inspection criteria. Add trigger conditions for accumulated maintenance hours. And the system catches this class of fault automatically. You don't need someone like me wandering through at 2 a.m. for it to work, Timothy." "Maybe not." He stepped back from the door to let Ronald through. "But it helps." They walked through the corridor without talking. At the point where the corridor split toward the parking lot, they stopped. Timothy put his badge back on his lanyard. "First author credit on that paper is right. I want you to know I agree with it, Ronald." "Stephanie suggested it, Timothy." "I know she did. And I told her she was right." He looked somewhere past Ronald's shoulder for a moment, the look of someone saying something they're still determining how to frame. 11 years ago, when I started here, I would have told you that technical credibility and formal qualification were the same thing. I'm revising that position, Ronald. Slow process, Timothy. Takes what it takes. He nodded once, turned toward his office. Go home, Ronald. Get some sleep. Ronald went home. He didn't sleep immediately. He sat at the kitchen table for 20 minutes, in the specific quiet that falls over a house when a child who usually fills it is at school and the absence is its own presence. He thought about Timothy Nash in the doorway with his badge in his hand. He thought about what it cost certain people to revise certain positions, and he thought that the cost was real and shouldn't be dismissed just because the revision came late. He thought about his father, who had said, "The machine tells you the truth if you know how to listen." And he thought, so do people, most of the time. You just have to be patient about the timing. Then he went to sleep. The competition was held in Carver Elementary's gymnasium on a Saturday morning in October. 28 teams from across Fulton County. The gym smelled like floor wax and the particular anticipation of a lot of children who had worked very hard at something and were about to find out whether the work was enough. Ronald sat in the third row, left side. He'd arrived 25 minutes early. He had coffee and a phone that was already at 60% battery from the 12 pictures he'd taken of Brianna's robot before leaving the apartment. He had not told Brianna that anyone else from Holt Aerotech would be there. He didn't know himself until the doors opened for seating, and he registered in his peripheral vision a woman in dark jeans and a black sweater who sat down in the row behind him without announcing herself. He recognized the posture before he saw the face. He didn't turn around. For a while they both looked at the gymnasium floor where the competition brackets were being set up. Children in matching team shirts, judges with clipboards, a table of trophies that caught the overhead lighting. Then, without turning around, Ronald said, "You didn't have to come," and Sandra Holt, who had not told Angela where she was going and had not put this on her calendar and had made the decision sometime after midnight on Friday and had not examined it very carefully, said, "I wanted to see." He let that sit for a moment. "She doesn't know you're here, Sandra?" "I know." The brackets were announced. Team Phoenix, Brianna's team, was in the second group of the third round. Ronald tracked this without showing that he was tracking it. "She named the team," he said. Not loud, not turning. "Phoenix." "Because phoenixes don't stay down." Sandra didn't answer immediately. Then, "She's 8, Ronald." "I know, Sandra. Where does an 8-year-old get that?" Ronald finally turned, just slightly, just enough to have the question land somewhere real, from watching someone get back up. Sandra Holt sat in the second row of a school gymnasium on a Saturday morning in October, and felt something move through her chest that she'd been trying to accurately name since Wednesday and was still failing at. It wasn't admiration exactly. It was closer to recognition, the recognition of something familiar seen from a new angle. Team Phoenix competed in round 3 at 10:47 a.m. The robot, a small articulated arm mounted on a wheeled platform, sorted 8 items in 2 minutes and 38 seconds. Correct identification on all 8. The crowd in the section around Team Phoenix registered this with the specific energy of people who understand they've just seen something go better than it needed to. Brianna stood beside her teammates with her hands clasped in front of her, and the expression of someone who is trying very hard not to show how much this matters to them, which was an expression Ronald recognized because he wore it himself approximately 3 times a week. The final results came 20 minutes later. Team Phoenix, first place, and Brianna Webb did not shriek or jump or pump her fist. She went completely still for 1 second, and then turned and found her father in the third row, and her face did the thing it did the going still before the breaking open. And she came through the gymnasium at a velocity that suggested she was not concerned about obstacles. Ronald stood up. "No, She hit him at something between a run and a launch, and he caught her the way he'd been catching her since she was 2 years old, and she held on with both arms around his neck and her feet off the floor, and he held on back, and neither of them said anything for a long moment. In the row behind him, Sandra Holt watched this and was very quiet. She had been in a lot of rooms. She had watched a lot of significant things happen. She could not remember the last time something had happened in a room she was in, and she had felt it this directly. Like it was happening to her, not just around her. She sat with that, after the ceremony, after the photographs and the trophy and the conversations with judges and the other teams, and Edward Okafor, who was visibly moved and trying to be professional about it. Brianna came looking for Ronald and found him standing near the bleachers with a woman she didn't recognize. She stopped, assessed. The assessment took about 2 seconds. Then, "Are you my bar's boss?" Sandra crouched to eye level. The gesture came naturally, without calculation. Sort of, yes. Brianna's eyes tracked sideways to Ronald, back to Sandra. "Are you his girlfriend?" Ronald made a sound that was not quite a cough. Sandra's expression moved through something she couldn't immediately categorize. "No. I'm his, we work together." Brianna considered this with the unsparing directness of someone too young to have learned the social value of pretending not to have noticed things. "Oh, then. You're really pretty." Sandra's throat did something she hadn't expected. "You're very smart, Brianna, without missing a beat." "I know. Do you want to see how the robot works?" "I can explain the sensor calibration. It's not that hard once you understand the basic logic." Sandra looked past her at Ronald, who was standing with his hands in his pockets and the expression of a man watching two people he knows navigate each other and making no move to intervene. "If you want to explain it," Sandra said to Brianna. "I want to hear it." Brianna took this at face value and launched into a detailed explanation of proximity sensors and color identification algorithms that Sandra followed approximately 60% of, because the other 40% required a prerequisite understanding of the specific library Brianna's team had used, which was not standard. It was the most technically specific conversation Sandra Holt had been part of, in the presence of a child, since she herself had been one. When Brianna ran back to her teammates to coordinate a group photo, Ronald moved to stand beside Sandra. "Ronald, sorry about," Sandra cut him off. "Don't apologize." Her voice was quieter than her office voice. The voice of someone who is not performing anything. "She's wonderful." Ronald watched Brianna organizing her teammates for the photograph with the particular authority of someone who has decided how picture should look and sees no reason why everyone else shouldn't agree. "Yeah, she really is." They stood there for a moment, side by side, not looking at each other, watching a gymnasium full of children and parents and teachers in the specific light of a Saturday morning that had turned out better than expected. And Sandra Holt thought, "I've been in this building 6 years and I've never been here on a Saturday, and then I've never had a reason to be." And then, quietly, to herself, "That's a different problem." She didn't say any of that, but she was still thinking about it when she drove home. Which meant it was the kind of thought that wasn't going anywhere on its own. The kind that needed to be followed somewhere. She just hadn't decided where yet. 6 weeks after the Bell 407 demonstration, Donald Spears called Sandra at 9:15 on a Monday morning. Sandra was at her desk. She knew the call was coming because she knew Spears and she knew his rhythms. Good result on Medflight South. Spears had the voice of someone who'd spent 40 years in boardrooms, not unpleasant, just precise in the way that reminded you he was always managing something. "I hear there was some difficulty on the day of the demonstration, Sandra. There was a maintenance issue with the prototype that was resolved before the demo." Spears. "I heard it was resolved by a member of custodial staff." Sandra. "I heard the same thing." A team member with a background in military aviation maintenance identified and corrected a physical fault that our diagnostic systems hadn't flagged. The aircraft performed to spec. Medflight South signed. Spears tried a different angle. "The protocol concern," Sandra didn't let it land. "The protocol concern is that our diagnostic systems have a gap for physical surface inspection without trigger criteria. I've asked Stephanie Monroe and the employee in question to document the methodology and the gap. We'll update the protocol." She paused for exactly the length of pause that meant I'm not done. "If you want to have a board conversation about how that gap was identified, I'm available Monday afternoon." Spears was quiet for 2 seconds. 2 seconds from Spears was the equivalent of several minutes from most people. "No need," he said. "Congratulations again on the contract." After the call ended, Sandra sat at her desk and experienced the specific satisfaction of having handled something correctly. Not the satisfaction of winning, the satisfaction of having been prepared, of having read the room correctly, of not having given ground she didn't need to give. Then she opened the security footage from 3 weeks ago again. The clip of Ronald noticing the pressure readout. She watched his head tilt, watched his eyes move across the data with the specific focus of someone who has seen what they're looking at before and is confirming what they think they know. She had watched this clip 4 times now. She wasn't entirely sure why she kept watching it. She was beginning to think she knew. The week after the competition, Sandra Holt did thwart in something she hadn't done in 6 years of running this company. She came in late, not dramatically late, not the kind of late that generates concern or rescheduled meetings. She arrived at 8:52 instead of 7:30, which for Sandra was the equivalent of showing up in pajamas. Angela noted it without commenting on it, which meant Angela had been watching something develop and had the professional wisdom not to name it until it named itself. Sandra had been awake since 4 a.m. Not with work, not with the MedFlight South contract, or the protocol documentation, or the 3 outstanding items from the board's last session. She'd been awake with the particular insomnia of someone whose mind has been given a new problem to work on and has decided that 4 a.m. is an excellent time to work on it. The problem was this. She had built out her entire professional life on a specific principle. Results came from the right people in the right roles, with the right credentials. You assessed credentials, you assigned roles, you measured results. The chain was clear. The chain was reliable. The chain had taken a company from the edge of closure to a $200 million operation in 6 years. Except the chain had a gap in it, and the gap had been standing 12 feet away from her at 2 in the morning for 6 years, wearing an employee badge that said custodial staff, and seeing things that the right people in the right roles with the right credentials had been walking past without seeing. Which meant the principle wasn't wrong, it was incomplete, which was, in some ways, worse than wrong. Wrong you could correct with a reversal. Incomplete required you to rebuild from the foundation. She drove in thinking about this, walked past Angela's desk thinking about this, closed her office door and stood at the window, looking down at the hangar and thought, I don't know. What I don't know? That's always been true. But this week I learned something specific about where the gap is. And now I can't unknow it. She pressed her intercom. Angela, yes? Get me the foundation grant documentation for Carver Elementary. I want to review what we committed before it goes to final disbursement. It's ready for your signature, I know. I want to read it again first. She read it again. The $42,000 figure looked different from how it had looked when she'd authorized it, not smaller. More specific, she could put a face to it now. Several faces, Brianna, and her 2 teammates in matching team shirts, and Edward Okafor trying not to cry at the trophy presentation, and a gymnasium full of children who'd had more equipment for the past 3 weeks than they'd had in the 3 years before that. She signed it. Then she opened a new document and started drafting something she hadn't planned to draft. It took her 40 minutes and 3 complete restarts. When she was done, it was a letter. To Lawrence, her father. Not a business update, not a Sunday call summary. An actual letter, the kind she'd written to him when she was 12. And he'd sent her to a summer academic program in Charlotte, and she'd been homesick in a way she'd refused to admit to anyone in person, but had been able to put on paper in the specific anonymity that distance creates. She didn't send it yet. She printed it, folded it, put it in her jacket pocket. Then she went back to work, because that was what she did. But the letter stayed in her pocket all day, which was the point. The letter to Lawrence had not been sent by the following Tuesday. Sandra had carried it for 10 days in various jacket pockets, transferring it each morning with the automatic reach of something that had become reflex. She wasn't ready to send it, and she wasn't ready to throw it away. which left the third option of keeping it on her person, like a decision that hadn't finished being made. She called Lawrence on a Tuesday night instead, not Sunday, not 6 p.m., which was when she'd stopped working and had eaten dinner and had been sitting in her apartment with a glass of water looking at the Atlanta skyline and thinking about a conversation she hadn't quite known how to start. Lawrence picked up on the second ring. He always picked up on the second ring, which was the habit of someone who'd spent years waiting for calls that might not come. Sandra? She didn't use the familiar form. Often it was a word that lived in the part of her that had been 11 years old when her mother died and hadn't fully come back out since. She used it when she needed to speak from there rather than from the part that ran board meetings. "Bah. I need to talk to you about something." He was quiet in the way that meant he was listening completely. "I've been wrong about something for a long time," she said. "Not wrong like a mistake. Wrong like a framework that was partly right, and I took it to be fully right because the part that was right saved me enough times that I stopped checking the part that wasn't." "Lawrence, what's the framework?" "Sandra, that what people can prove on paper is the same as what they actually know." Lawrence was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Your mother had a saying." Sandra had heard many of her mother's sayings through Lawrence, because Lawrence had collected them the way some people collect photographs carefully, kept them for when the moment fit. What was it? Lawrence's voice was gentle with memory. "The tree that looks strong from the road has roots you can't see from the road." She said it about people mostly. About doctors who underestimated her because she wasn't a doctor. About nurses who saw things the doctors missed because they were there more. He paused. She would have liked this conversation. Sandra pressed her palm against her sternum, which was a thing she did and had never told anyone she did. "I let someone go for 6 years without seeing them, Lawrence, and now you see them, Sandra." "Yes." His voice had the particular gentleness of someone who had survived enough to know which things were worth being hard about and which things weren't. "Then the question isn't what took so long. The question is what you do with the seeing." Sandra looked at the skyline for a moment. "I'm figuring that out, Lawrence." "Good." A pause. "Is this person someone I'm going to hear more about, Sandra?" "Probably." "Lawrence." "Okay." And then, with the timing of someone who'd raised a daughter and knew exactly when to stop pushing. "How's the contract situation?" They talked for another 40 minutes, about MedFlight South and the board and the new protocol documentation and Lawrence's physical therapy appointments and his neighbor, who'd been teaching him chess for 3 months and was losing patience with his progress. She laughed twice, real laughs, the kind that rearranged the quality of the room. After she hung up, she took the letter out of her jacket pocket, read it, folded it again, put it back. "Some things you keep on your person until you know what to do with them." November in Atlanta. The light going sideways earlier each day. The temperature dropping into the kind of range that Atlanta always seemed slightly surprised by, despite November arriving on schedule every year. The technical paper was in its 3rd draft. Stephanie had restructured the methodology section twice. Ronald had added 2 case studies from the notebook, both from Holt Aerotech's own fleet, both documenting faults caught by observation that hadn't triggered automated alerts. The second case study was the Bell 407. Stephanie had been precise about how to frame it, not as an indictment of the existing diagnostic protocol, but as evidence for a complementary approach. Timothy had reviewed the framing and signed off. The journal had it under review. Ronald filed his 4th weekly observation report on a Monday morning. Stephanie responded by Tuesday with a question about a vibration pattern he'd noted in the secondary production hangar. He answered Wednesday. She sent the note to Timothy Thursday. Timothy issued a maintenance check order Friday. The maintenance check found what Ronald had noted. Minor. Early stage. Caught before it became anything else. George Price heard about it from the maintenance tech who'd done the check, who'd heard from Stephanie, who hadn't said Ronald's name, but had referenced an observationally report in a way that George, who knew Ronald, found immediately translatable. That's 3. George said at 3 a.m. the following Thursday. Thermos between them, both of them, in chairs that had been uncomfortable for 6 years, and would continue to be. 3 catches in 6 weeks from those reports. Ronald. Second one was borderline. George. Still a catch. Ronald. Still early. George looked at him. Mop cart got fixed. Ronald looked at the cart in the corner. Left rear wheel. It had been replaced with a new caster 2 weeks ago, part of a general supply room upgrade that had materialized alongside a broader facilities review. I noticed, Ronald said. George, you didn't say anything. Ronald, what's there to say? George poured more coffee. Some people would make a big deal out of it. Ronald looked at his cup. Some people make a big deal out of things that shouldn't need to be. It was always supposed to be fixed. Now it's fixed. That's the whole story. George was quiet for a moment. Then, you know what I've always thought about you? Ronald, don't, George. You never need anyone to tell you what you're worth. Ronald looked at him. George, I'm serious, Ronald. I know you're serious. That's why I'm saying don't, not sharp. Just enough. I'm not an inspirational story. I'm a man doing a job that matters and wanting to be paid correctly for it, and wanting to go home to my daughter on time. That's the whole thing. That's all there is. George absorbed this, nodded once, poured more coffee. You're a pain in the neck, he said. Ronald, you've been saying that for 6 years. George, it keeps being true. The day before the regional robotics competition, Brianna came home from the final team practice with her equipment box, and a look on her face that Ronald had learned to read as something happened that I'm still processing. He was in the kitchen. Let her drop her bag, pour herself a glass of water, eat 3 crackers. Gave her the time. Marcus says our robot is the most advanced one he's seen in the junior division, she finally offered. Marcus was 12 and had already been to 1 regional competition and had opinions. Ronald, what do you think? Brianna, I think Marcus talks too much, but he's probably right. She looked at her crackers. Put one down. What if we win? Ronald looked at her. What happens if you win? Brianna, the top 2 teams get summer program spots. Georgia Tech 3 weeks. She picked up a cracker. Put it down. I've never been away from home for 3 weeks, Ronald. Would you want to go? She looked at him with an expression that was trying to be more complicated than it was. Would you be okay? Ronald Webb, who had been deployed for 9 months at a stretch, who had sat in places he couldn't name in public, and held it together, because holding it together was the job, looked at his 8-year-old daughter across a kitchen table, and understood that the question she was actually asking was not about logistics. Brianna, I will always be okay. My okay is not your job. Your job is to be 8 years old and build things and figure out what you want. She was quiet for a moment. But what if I miss you, Ronald? Then you'll miss me. That's allowed. He leaned forward slightly. Missing someone doesn't mean you made the wrong choice. She thought about this. Then, with the abrupt subject shifting of someone whose emotional processing works faster than their conversational transitions. What did you build when you were 8? He thought about his father's garage. About a Saturday morning with an engine in pieces on a drop cloth and Earl Webb's hands on a wrench and the particular smell of old oil and concrete. I built things with my father. In the garage, Brianna. What kinds of things? Ronald, mostly I handed him tools and watched. Brianna, that's not building, Ronald. That's how you start. He picked up her cracker and handed it back to her. Eat something, she ate. He started dinner. After she was in bed, Ronald sat at the kitchen table with his notebook open to a clean page. He didn't write anything for a while. Just sat with the pen in his hand and the quiet of the apartment around him. Then he wrote, what you understand you can fix. What you don't understand you can't even see. He looked at that for a moment. Put the pen down. He was thinking about the notebook entries on pressure patterns. About the 4 entries over 14 months that documented something nobody else had documented. He'd seen it. He'd written it down. He'd had no channel for it to go anywhere useful. Now there was a channel. And something about that, the existence of the channel, the fact of being heard, had changed the quality of the work itself. Not the observation. The observation had always been what it was. But the writing of it felt different now. less like speaking into an empty room, more like a conversation with someone who was actually in the room and actually listening. He closed the notebook, checked that Brianna's equipment box was by the door for the morning, turned off the kitchen light. The journal accepted the paper in April. Stephanie sent the confirmation email at 11:23 a.m. on a Tuesday. Ronald was asleep. He saw it at 4:15 when his alarm went off, and he checked his phone with the automatic reach of a man who'd learned that anything requiring his attention could arrive at any hour. Journal of Aviation Maintenance and Engineering has accepted your submission. Physical fault diagnosis in rotary wing aircraft, complementing automated systems with field-based observation. Webb, R. and Monroe, S. The paper will appear in the June issue. He read it twice. Then he got up, made coffee, started getting ready to pick up Brianna. At 4:47, Stephanie called. He answered. I saw. Stephanie's voice had an energy in it that wasn't her usual precision. First author in a peer-reviewed journal. How does that feel? He thought about the notebook. About 9 years of filling notebooks in conditions that were not designed for notebooks. About 6 years of filling them in a building where the information had nowhere to go. About the shift between those two states, which had been created not by anything he'd done differently, but by a helicopter that refused to start on the worst possible morning. It feels accurate, he said. A pause. Then Stephanie laughed, a real one. Of course it does. Another pause, her voice shifting into the register she used for things that mattered. Timothy is submitting a protocol amendment to the FAA maintenance guidance based on the case studies in the paper. Your methodology is going to be in the federal maintenance guidelines. Ronald was quiet. Ronald. Stephanie's voice was careful now, precise in the way it got when she was moved by something and was being exact about it. That's going to save lives. He thought about a crew in a sandstorm. About 14 hours of keeping 2 aircraft in the air with nothing but his hands and what 9 years had built in him. About the specific feeling of watching those aircraft fly at the end of it. About everyone who came home. Yeah, he said. It will. Timothy Nash sent the paper to the engineering team with a 1-line note. Read this, then come find me and we'll talk about what we're changing. Stephanie printed a copy and left it on Ronald's supply room workbench with a sticky note that said simply, You, George Price, who did not read technical journals and had no intention of starting, asked Ronald to explain it to him, in English at 3 a.m., and got a 40-minute explanation that he followed approximately half of and found, despite the gaps, genuinely interesting. Sandra read it at her desk on a Tuesday morning in June. All of it. Not the abstract. All of it. She'd read technical papers before engineering documentation, maintenance protocols, compliance reports. She read them efficiently, with the skimming competence of someone who needed the key points and didn't need every supporting clause. She didn't skim this one. She read the methodology section 3 times. Not because it was difficult, because it was precise in a way that was recognizable. The particular precision of someone who had developed a framework under conditions that didn't allow imprecision. Every step documented in the same economical way that the notebook entries were documented. No decoration, no hedging, no unnecessary clause between the observation and the conclusion. The value of systematic field observation, the paper argued, is not that it replaces automated diagnostic systems, but that it captures the class of fault that falls between measurement points. The physical state of a component exists in spaces that sensors do not occupy. Understanding what to look for in those spaces requires pattern recognition developed through exposure, the kind of exposure that is accumulated, not taught. She read that paragraph 4 times. Then she sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling. The kind of exposure that is accumulated, not taught. 6 years of walking the same floors. 6 years of looking at the same machines. 6 years of writing down what the machines were doing in a notebook that had nowhere to go. And the thing that made it that valuable wasn't the notebook, it was the 6 years. The accumulated pattern of attention. The seeing that happens when you're present enough, long enough, with no other purpose than to see. She picked up her phone, texted Ronald. I read it. 3 minutes later. Okay. She looked at the word for a moment, then typed. The paragraph about accumulated exposure. I'm thinking about it. A longer pause this time. Then, so am I. She put her phone down, went back to work. But the paragraph stayed with her for the rest of the day. The way things stay with you when they've named something you've been circling for? A while without finding the center. Brianna left for Georgia Tech in late June, 3 weeks. The summer STEM program. Ronald packed her bags with the methodical completeness of someone who'd packed gear for deployments and understood that the thing you forget on the first day is the thing you think about every subsequent day. Brianna supervised the packing with the authority of someone who had opinions about the correct folding of her project notebook. It goes on top, she said. Not in the side pocket. If it gets bent in the side pocket, I won't be able to read the pages properly. Ronald, I know how to pack a notebook. Brianna, you put yours in the side pocket. Ronald, my notebook is waterproof. He adjusted the placement. Happy? Brianna, mostly. She sat on the edge of the bed and watched him zip the bag. Bah? Ronald, yeah, Brianna. Does Miss Holt know I'm going to be gone? He looked at her. Why would Miss Holt know that? Brianna looked at him with the expression she'd inherited from Sharon, the one that said, I am 8 years old, and I see through you completely, and we both know it. Because you talk to her, Ronald. We work together, Brianna. You talk to her about things that aren't work, Ronald. What makes you say that? Brianna, because when work people call you, you look at the phone first and then answer it. When she calls, you just answer it. She shrugged, with the particular casualness of someone deploying a significant observation and pretending it's minor. Also, you laugh differently. He looked at his daughter. She looked back. Brianna, I'm not saying it's bad. She pulled at a thread on the bedspread. I like her. She explained the Medflight South contract to me when I asked her about it, and she didn't make it simpler than it actually is. Adults always make things simpler when they're talking to me. Ronald, because you're 8. Brianna, I know things for 8. A pause. She talks to me like I know things. Ronald sat down on the chair beside the bed, looked at his daughter. She looked back with the directness that was Sharon's, and the patience that was something else. Something that had been developed in a household, where questions sometimes got answered slowly, and the household was still safe, regardless. I don't know what it is, he said. Brianna, that's okay. She reached for her notebook and put it in her lap. I just wanted to say I'm not weird about it. In case you were wondering, Ronald. I wasn't wondering, Brianna. You were a little wondering. He didn't argue with this. Bah. She opened the notebook to a blank page, clicked her pen. You should tell her, Ronald. Tell her what, Brianna? Whatever it is you're not telling her. She looked at the blank page. You always say that not saying things uses more energy than saying them, because then you have to carry what you didn't say and what you wanted to say at the same time. That's more weight. He looked at her for a long moment. When did I say that? Brianna, last year. When I didn't tell Marcus I wanted to be team lead and then was frustrated that I wasn't team lead, she started writing something in the notebook. It's good advice. You should follow it. He stood up, picked up the bag. Let's get you to campus. She closed the notebook, stood up, looked at him with the Sharon-inherited expression one more time. I'm just saying, Ronald. I know you're just saying, Brianna. Okay, let's go. He drove her to Georgia Tech and carried her bag to the dorm and helped her set up the desk the way she wanted it, with the notebook on top, within easy reach, and the equipment case on the shelf where she could see it. He checked the window latch twice. He checked that the fire exit was clearly marked. He checked that her ID card worked on the building door. Brianna watched him do all of this with the patience of someone who understood that this was not about fire exits. When he ran out of things to check, she looked at him. Bah, Ronald. Yeah, Brianna, I'm going to be okay, Ronald. I know, Brianna. And you're going to be okay, Ronald. I know, Brianna. Okay, she hugged him. Not the launched across a gymnasium hug, the quiet kind. The kind that means I know you're not going to say everything you're feeling and I'm not going to make you. He held on for a moment, Then she stepped back and looked at him with the steady eyes that were Sharon's. "Come home safe," she said. "That's the main thing. Always come home safe." He drove back on I-85 in June evening light, the city gold-lit and warm, the radio off, the particular quiet of a man who has just left his daughter somewhere good and is driving back to a place that will be different without her in it, and has decided to be okay with both of those things simultaneously. He got home at 5:40. The apartment was quiet in the way it went quiet when Brianna wasn't there, not empty, because places that have held the right people don't go empty when those people step out, but distinctly without her particular frequency. He made dinner for one, which he hadn't done in 6 years. Found he'd made too much, because his hands had been calibrated for 2 portions for so long they didn't know how to make one. At 7:15, his phone rang. "Sandra," he answered. "She gets settled in okay?" "Sandra, she sent me a photo of the lab. There's a laser cutter. She described it in detail." "Ronald, sounds right." A pause. "How did she get your number?" "Sandra, I gave it to her at the competition. She asked for it. I didn't think quickly enough to have a reason not to give it." Ronald looked at the extra portion of dinner on the stove. "She told me I should tell you something, Sandra." "What something?" He looked out the kitchen window. The evening was softening into blue. A cardinal, improbable, small, completely certain of itself, sat on the fence post at the edge of the yard and looked at nothing in particular. She said, "Whatever I'm not saying is using more energy than saying it would." He watched the cardinal. "She's 8, and she's right, which is annoying." Sandra was quiet for a moment. Then, carefully, "What are you not saying?" He turned from the window, leaned against the counter, looked at the apartment that had been calibrated for 2 people for 6 years and was calibrated for 1 tonight. "That this matters," he said. "Whatever it is. It matters. Silence on the line, not empty silence. The kind of silence that means the person on the other end is being careful with what they say next, because what they say next is going to mean something." "I know," Sandra said, quietly. "I've known for a while, Ronald." Sandra. "Why didn't you say something?" Sandra. "Because I was trying to figure out whether I knew it because it was true or because I wanted it to be true. Those are different things, and I needed to be sure before I said anything." A pause. "I'm sure." He looked at the cardinal on the fence post. It ruffled its feathers once, settled itself, and stayed. "I'm going to ask you something," he said. "Sandra." "Okay, Ronald. And I want you to answer it the way you answer things that matter and not the way you answer things in board meetings." "Sandra, those are different registers." "I know the difference, Ronald." "Okay." He paused. "What do you want?" Sandra Holt, who ran a $200 million company and had answered harder questions than this in more consequential rooms, sat in her apartment on a Tuesday evening in June and was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I want to figure it out. Not in a meeting. Not with an agenda. Just figure it out." Another pause. "Is that an acceptable answer?" Ronald. "That's an honest answer." Sandra. "Same thing. To me." He looked at the food on the stove. "I made too much dinner. A beat. Did you, Ronald?" "My hands don't know how to make 1 portion, Sandra. That's a logistical problem." Ronald. "It is, Sandra. It could theoretically be addressed." Ronald. "It could." The cardinal on the fence post flew away, gone in a beat of red. "I'm 20 minutes out," Sandra said. "I'll set the table," Ronald said. They ate dinner at a kitchen table that had been, at various points, a robotics workshop and a homework station, and a grief processing space, and a dinner table for 2, and was now, for the first time in 6 years, a dinner table for 2 in a different configuration. Sandra arrived at 7:38 with a bottle of sparkling water she'd stopped to buy on the way, because arriving empty-handed at someone's dinner table felt wrong, and a bottle of wine felt presumptuous, in a way she couldn't fully articulate, but trusted. Ronald had set 2 places with the careful evenness of a man who sets tables the way he packs equipment with attention. Without decoration, the overhead light was on. The kitchen smelled like what he'd made, which was rice, and a simple protein dish that he'd been making since before Brianna was born, and had never found a reason to change because Brianna liked it, and he was consistent about things that worked. Sandra sat down. looked at the table, looked at the kitchen, which she was seeing clearly for the first time, not the building she owned floors above, not the employee break room, not a professional context of any kind. A kitchen, small, clean, a child's artwork held to the refrigerator with magnets, a shelf near the door with Brianna's equipment case on it, and a row of Ronald's notebooks, 6 of them, spines labeled by year. She keeps her case by the door, Sandra said. Ronald, in case she needs to grab it fast. Her idea when she was 6. Said she didn't want to waste time looking for it if there was an emergency. Sandra looked at the shelf. What counts as a robotics emergency for a 6-year-old? Ronald, apparently several things. I stopped asking after the 3rd one. Sandra looked at the notebooks. Those are all from here? Ronald, 6 years. 2 a year roughly. Depends on how much there is to write. She was quiet for a moment. How many from before? Ronald, 4. From the army. They're not here, Sandra. Where are they? Ronald, storage unit off MLK. With some other things I'm not ready to get rid of but don't need to see every day. She understood the distinction. She had a box in her own closet that operated on the same principle, her mother's handwriting on recipe cards, a photograph from a trip they'd taken to Savannah. When Sandra was 9, the last birthday card Carol had written before the heart that everyone assumed was fine turned out not to be. Things you keep without looking at. Things whose value is in existing, not in being seen. They talked about Lawrence and his chess game, which was improving according to Lawrence and not improving according to his chess teacher, whose patience was a finite resource. They talked about Brianna's laser cutter photo and the 17-message text thread Brianna had keyed text thread. Brianna had started with Sandra about the project she was going to build, which Sandra had read with complete attention and responded to with specific questions. Because Brianna, she had discovered, could tell the difference between someone reading carefully and someone nodding along. They talked about the paper, and about the protocol amendment, and about what Timothy Nash had said when he'd heard the FALC in the updated maintenance guidance, which was nothing dramatic. Just good. And then a long silence that contained everything dramatic. They talked about Sharon. Not the loss of her, they'd covered that ground before, carefully, in ways that had left it properly tended rather than raw. They talked about the specific quality of her. She sounds like someone who understood that presence is the thing, Sandra said. Ronald, it's the main thing. Most other things come from it or don't happen without it. Sandra looked at her water glass. I've been absent from a lot of things, Ronald. You've been building something, Sandra. People say that like it excuses the absences, Ronald. I'm not saying it excuses them. I'm saying it explains them. He picked up his fork. You can acknowledge the cost and the reason at the same time. They don't cancel each other out. She looked at him. Is that the voice of experience? Ronald, 9 years of deployments. I missed things. I also did work that mattered. Both are true. Neither one makes the other not true. She thought about this for a while. I'm going to be different, she said, in some ways. I'm already different than I was in September. I'm not sure how much of that is the company changing, and how much is me changing, and how much is this, a gesture that included him and the table and the kitchen and whatever this was. Ronald, probably all 3. Things usually change from more than one direction at once. Sandra, that's inconvenient, Ronald. Most true things are. She looked at him, and she did it the way she'd been learning to look at things all the way at them, without the filtering that had been second nature for 20 years, at the man who'd fixed a helicopter in 2 hours and 13 minutes, and asked for lights in a school lab, who'd spent 6 years in a building without asking anyone to see him, who'd sat at a loading dock table on a rainy December night and said you're not wrong about being pretty with no build-up and no landing, and no intention of making anything out of it. Ronald, yeah, Sandra? Thank you. Ronald looked at her. For what specifically, Sandra? For being exactly what you are and not apologizing for any of it. She held his gaze. I've been in a lot of rooms with a lot of people who were performing a version of themselves. You don't do that, Ronald. I don't have the energy for it, Sandra. I know. But you could. Most people in your position would. Ronald, resentment is expensive. And I've never been good at spending energy on things that don't produce anything. She absorbed this. The evening had given way to full dark, and the kitchen window now showed the yard as a black square, with the fence post as a silhouette, and the city glow above it like a low watercolor wash. I need to tell you something, Sandra said. Ronald waited. When I read your file after the demonstration, that afternoon, the line that stopped me wasn't the commendations or the GPA or the 9 years. She looked at the table. It was reason for separation. Family. 2 words. And I sat with those 2 words for a long time because I understood what they meant. Not just the literal meaning. The choice underneath it. She looked back up. You chose her, Ronald. Every time. Every time it's a choice. I choose her, Sandra. I know. Her voice was quieter than it had been all evening. I wanted you to know that I see that. What it costs. What it looks like from the outside. She paused. She's going to do extraordinary things because she had a father who made that choice. The kitchen was very quiet. Ronald Webb, who had kept helicopters flying in impossible conditions and raised a daughter alone and filed observation SOP reports into a void for 6 years, looked at Sandra Holt across a kitchen table and felt something shift in the interior architecture of himself. Small, structural, the kind of shift that doesn't announce itself loudly because it's load-bearing, and load-bearing things move slowly. She's already doing extraordinary things, he said. Sandra, I know. She looked at him. So are you. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then Ronald reached across the table and picked up her empty water glass, stood up, refilled it at the sink, set it back in front of her, sat back down. Sandra looked at the glass, then at him. That's it, Ronald? That's it. He picked up his fork. It's getting late. You have a 7:30 review in the morning, Sandra. I do, Ronald. And I have a 6-hour shift starting at 11. Sandra. You do, Ronald. So, he looked at her. We should probably finish dinner. She picked up her fork, and then she laughed. The real one, not the boardroom register, not the managed register, not the register of someone performing appropriate warmth. The laugh of someone who has been trying very hard for a long time and has just been offered the specific relief of not having to try for a minute. You are, she said, the most infuriating person I've met in 15 years of professional life, Ronald. I'll put it on the resume, Sandra. You don't have a resume, Ronald. I have a notebook. She shook her head. 8. The night sat around the apartment the way nights sit around spaces that have held something significant, not loudly, just present, aware. When she left at 9:47, because she had a 7:30 review and she kept her commitments, Ronald stood in the doorway and watched her walk to her car in the driveway. She turned at the end of the walkway. He was still there. Ronald, yeah, Sandra, next week, Ronald, yeah. She got in the car. He watched the headlights come on, and the car back out and the tail sights go red at the end of the street, and then turn and disappear. He went back inside. Finished cleaning up. Packed his supply bag for the shift at 11. Fed the information he'd noted about a vibration pattern in the production floor 3rd bay. Left station into the Monday report form. Even though it was Tuesday, because the form was the form, and the system worked when you used the system. At 11 p.m. exactly, he walked into Holt Aerotech through the employee entrance. George was at the gate. Thermos, the expression of someone who has been sitting with information all evening. She was here, Ronald. She was, George, to see you? Ronald, to have dinner. George processed this with the particular economy of a man who had waited 6 years for a development of this nature, and was now choosing not to make a production of it. How was it? Ronald held out his cup. She said the coffee was terrible. George poured. She's not wrong, Ronald. No, she's usually not. He picked up his cart, checked the left rear wheel still fixed, still quiet. He pushed the cart into the hangar. The Bell 407 GXI was in its bay. Post-maintenance, covers on. Quiet. He walked past it, stopped, put his hand against the fuselage for a moment, 3 points, the old habit, and listened to what the metal had to say. Nothing wrong. Everything working as designed. He nodded once and kept going. Some machines, when you fixed them right, ran better than they had before the fault. Not because the fault had improved them, but because finding it and fixing it required you to look at every adjacent system, and sometimes you found something in the adjacent systems that you adjusted without meaning to, and the adjustment turned out to matter. He thought about that as he pushed the cart toward the first section that needed cleaning. He thought about all the things that run better after you've been forced to really look at them. He thought about a woman who'd sat at his kitchen table and laughed without managing it. He thought about a daughter who was, at this moment, probably sketching something at a desk at Georgia Tech with a notebook on top and a laser cutter she was going to use tomorrow. He thought about his father in a garage in Mechanicsville on a Saturday morning, engine in pieces, patient, saying, "If you understand what a machine is trying to tell you, the machine will never let you down." He thought about how long it had taken him to understand that the principle had never been only about machines, that it had always been about everything. That attention, real attention, the sustained kind, the kind that cost something, was the thing that made broken things whole. In machines, in people, in the particular space between two people that starts as nothing and becomes, if you're careful and patient and willing to look at it without unlooking away, something worth protecting. He put his hand on the mop and got to work. The left rear wheel was quiet, the hanger was quiet, and Ronald Webb, Maintenance Technician Level 3, Safety Observation Specialist, first author, father, and the most infuriating person Sandra Holt had met in 15 years of professional life, moved through the building he'd worked in for 6 years, and saw everything there was to see, the way he always had, the way he always would. Because that was what you did when you understood what things were trying to tell you. You listened, you wrote it down, and you showed up again the next night and the night after that, and you kept listening. Because some things only reveal themselves over time. And time, it turned out, was the one thing Ronald Webb had always been willing to give. And have you ever walked past someone every single day and had no idea who they really were? Because Ronald Webb walked past a lot of people who had no idea who he was, for 6 years. And the thing is, he never needed them to know. He knew. He'd always known. It just took the right moment and the right silence, and one helicopter that refused to start, for the room to finally get quiet enough to see it too. Ronald Webb never needed anyone to tell him what he was worth. And that, maybe more than anything else in this story, is the thing worth remembering. Has someone ever surprised you like that? Someone you walked past every single day, and then one moment changed everything you thought you knew about them? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one.